What if the electorate you know is being dismantled right before your eyes? Imagine a coordinated effort to reshape the very foundation of American democracy, moving millions of people through a system hidden in plain sight. In just a few minutes, you will discover the chilling details of a plan that has detonated a political firestorm in Washington, revealing a calculated strategy that goes far beyond simple border mismanagement. This isn't just about policy, it's a conflict over the heart of the law and the future of the nation. But as the numbers come to light, one question remains. Is this a humanitarian necessity or a deliberate attempt to change the face of the country forever? Stephen Miller sits in a high-backed chair, the sterile studio lights of the news set reflecting in his steady, unblinking gaze. There is no shouting, no performative outrage, only a cold, methodical precision that makes his words feel like a prosecutor's closing argument. He delivers a single, chilling sentence regarding a hidden plan to fundamentally reshape the American electorate. This was not a loophole, he asserts. It was a plan. He begins detailing a coordinated system where the administration isn't just failing to stop illegal entry, but is actively facilitating it. He describes a pipeline, flying individuals into the interior, escorting them across the border, and granting them humanitarian parole. This status, he argues, leads straight to work permits, social security numbers, and ultimately, de facto access to the voting booth. The host freezes for a split second, the air in the studio growing heavy as the gravity of the accusation sinks in. Miller doesn't pause to let the tension dissipate. He sharpens his tone, calling the systematic processing of millions an attack on democracy itself. In a starkly different setting, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stands in her office, the frantic energy of Washington buzzing just outside her door. Her eyes are fixed on a glowing smartphone screen, watching the very clip that is currently detonating across social media. She watches as the view count ticks upward 1 million, 2 million, 4 million. Each tick represents a new person hearing Miller's methodical indictment. Her breathing sharpens, her expression tightening into a mask of visible fury. Her aides scroll through the erupting headlines on their own feeds, warning her that addressing such a polarizing figure might only legitimize his claims. But for Ocasio-Cortez, silence is no longer an option. This isn't just policy debate anymore, she says, her voice low and firm. They're saying we're criminals. To her, silence looks like guilt, and she refuses to let him define the country's values unchallenged. She tosses the phone onto her desk with a definitive clatter and reaches for her coat. With a look of cold determination, she heads toward the House floor, preparing to transform a policy rebuttal into a national spectacle, unaware that the collision of their words is about to make the entire room go silent. The tension that began in the news studio quickly migrated to the heart of American lawmaking. While the digital world was still reeling from the methodical accusations of a coordinated plan to reshape the electorate, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez prepared to mount a defense that transcended mere policy statistics. The House chamber, usually a cacophony of shuffling papers and whispered alliances, underwent a palpable transformation as she approached the podium. If you were watching the live feed at that moment, you could feel the temperature in the room drop. The sea of murmurs died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Standing before her colleagues, her voice emerged as a sharp, rhythmic contrast to Stephen Miller's clinical precision. Where he had used the language of a prosecutor, she spoke with a melodic, emotional cadence that sought to invoke the very soul of the nation. Her address was not merely a rebuttal. It was a curated national spectacle designed to spark a visceral reaction. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez deliberately wove historical threads into her rhetoric, drawing a direct line from the fight against the Confederacy to the modern struggle against what she characterized as the politics of exclusion. We are a nation that stood up to secret police, to fascism, to the politics of hate, she declared, her voice resonating through the chamber. She invoked the image of Lady Liberty, the monument to freedom standing tall in New York Harbor, framing the arrival of migrants not as a strategic threat, but as the fulfillment of a historic promise. To her, the immigration debate was a moral problem, a question of who deserves dignity and hope, rather than a math problem to be solved with border tallies. She spoke of children seeking refuge with a fire that aimed to scorch the cold logic of her opponents, portraying the current administrative actions as an act of compassion in the face of global desperation. Think about the scale of this ideological gap. On one side, you have the Statue of Liberty vision, an America defined by its promise as a sanctuary. On the other, a vision defined by its laws and borders. Which one speaks to you? This is exactly why the debate became so explosive so quickly. Miles away, the atmosphere was vastly different. In his office, Stephen Miller sat leaning back in his chair, watching the live feed of the House floor with a sense of clinical detachment. To him, the soaring metaphors and appeals to Lady Liberty were predictable. He watched her performance not as a fellow lawmaker, but as an analyst observing a strategic move. He turned to a nearby aide, his voice a low, steady whisper. He noted that while she was an effective performer who knew how to connect emotionally, her poetry was missing a vital component, the prose of reality. "There it is," he whispered, "the emotional appeal. No facts yet." He dismissively characterized her speech as an emotional appeal devoid of factual grounding. Even as she spoke of windows and welcoming arms, Miller began tapping a rhythmic cadence on a thick folder resting on his desk, a folder overflowing with internal Department of Homeland Security data. For Miller, the concept of national sovereignty was not a vague ideal but a tangible legal requirement, one he believed was being systematically dismantled through the misuse of humanitarian parole. The digital landscape mirrored this ideological split with violent speed. Within minutes of her concluding remarks, social media became a battlefield of competing narratives. If you were scrolling through X or TikTok that afternoon, your feed was likely split into two entirely different realities. Supporters rallied behind the hashtag number AOC Defend Democracy, praising her for standing up to what they viewed as a fascist rhetoric of fear. They shared clips of her mentioning the Confederacy, framing her as a modern-day warrior for civil rights. Conversely, critics and conservative commentators amplified Number Miller warning, arguing that her emotional display was a calculated distraction from the erosion of the rule of law. They replayed Miller's interview alongside her speech, highlighting the contrast between his numbers and her metaphors. The divide was no longer just about immigration numbers. It was about the fundamental interpretation of the American identity. One side saw a nation defined by its borders and laws. The other saw a nation defined by its inclusive promise. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finished her speech, the adrenaline was visible. Her hand trembled slightly as she gathered her notes, a physical manifestation of the intensity she had poured into her words. She had successfully shifted the frame from a cold policy discussion to a high-stakes moral crusade. However, the victory was localized to the chamber's emotions. As she walked off the floor and into the hallway, a swarm of reporters pressed forward, their microphones a forest of silver and black. One journalist shouted above the din, asking if she had a specific response to Stephen Miller's latest follow-up statement regarding the legal limits of executive discretion. She paused for only a second, her gaze steady and resolute. "I just gave it," she said simply, before walking away. She believed she had won the day with her appeal to the nation's conscience, but the prose she so readily dismissed was already being prepared for release. While she moved to take her message to the people through town halls and social platforms telling her followers to speak in faces, not reports, Stephen Miller was finalizing a move that would challenge the very foundation of her moral argument. He wasn't interested in the spotlight of the House floor. He was interested in the undeniable weight of the spreadsheet. If you find this clash between data and emotion as fascinating as we do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We're about to dive into the specific data that changed everything. Don't miss out on the next part of this breakdown, because the plot twist in the DHS report is something you haven't seen in the headlines yet. This clash between his methodical data and her passionate idealism was about to reach a tipping point that neither side could have fully anticipated. A report was about to surface that would force the conversation away from the shadows of history and back into the harsh light of contemporary statistics, turning the moral problem into a mathematical reality that could not be easily ignored. Imagine the moment those numbers hit the screen. Over 1.8 million migrants admitted under humanitarian parole in just 3 years, triple the previous decade. That isn't just a statistic, it's a structural shift. To apply this to your own perspective, try this. The next time you hear a political debate, ask yourself, is this poetry appealing to your values, or prose appealing to the mechanics of law? Recognizing which language a politician is speaking is the first step in seeing through the rhetoric. The silence she had commanded in the House chamber was about to be challenged by the loud, undeniable roar of a data tsunami that would leave both sides scrambling to reclaim the narrative of the real America. You can't ignore facts forever, but you also can't lead a nation without hope. As we move to the next chapter, ask yourself, when evidence meets emotion, who really wins the heart of the public? Stay tuned, because the confrontation in the studio is where these two worlds finally collide head-on. The escalating tension between poetic ideals and legal prose found its most explosive catalyst on a quiet Sunday morning. As the social media battle between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stephen Miller continued to rage, the information landscape underwent a seismic shift. A news studio that usually hummed with the predictable back and forth of political pundits suddenly fell into a stunned silence. The host leaned forward, holding a physical copy of a newly released Department of Homeland Security (DHS) report, his voice steady but carrying a note of genuine surprise. On the large screens behind him, a graphic flickered to life, displaying a number that would immediately dismantle the carefully curated narratives of the past week: 1.8 million. This was the data tsunami that Stephen Miller had been waiting for. The report confirmed that between 2021 and 2024, over 1.8 million migrants had been admitted into the United States under various humanitarian parole programs. To put that into perspective, the figure was nearly triple the total of the previous decade combined. The air in the studio thickened as the implications of the statistics sank in. For millions of viewers watching from home, the debate was no longer about abstract concepts of Lady Liberty or the shadows of the Confederacy. It had become a tangible reality hidden in plain sight. If you've ever felt like the news was holding back the full picture, this was the moment the floodgates opened. Stephen Miller returned to the airwaves almost immediately, but his demeanor had changed. He no longer needed to argue with the same intensity. He simply pointed at the screen. With a calm, calculated precision, he explained the ethics of what he termed mass importation versus the original intent of the law. He noted that humanitarian parole was a statute written for exceptional, individual emergencies, medical crises, or specific localized disasters, not as a mechanism for the political convenience of processing entire populations. When laws are bent for politics, he stated, his eyes locked on the camera, sovereignty dissolves. This is not about compassion. It is about the heart of the law. Miller broke down the numbers with surgical intent. He argued that the use of executive discretion had morphed into a de facto immigration system running parallel to the one established by Congress. By granting parole, the administration was providing immediate access to federal work permits and Social Security numbers benefits traditionally reserved for those with a settled legal status. He framed this as a corruption of citizenship, where the boundaries of the law were being blurred to achieve a specific electoral outcome. He wasn't just presenting a policy critique, he was laying out a prosecutorial case for a deliberate policy of mass entry. Across town, in the heart of a Bronx community center, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was surrounded by the very people she sought to protect. Usually, these town halls were her stronghold, places where her emotional resonance and personal connection created a shield against Washington's cold logic. But today, the atmosphere was different. The people she spoke to, working families, local shop owners, and young activists, were holding their phones. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at the DHS charts that were being shared side by side with her speeches. The contrast was stark. In one window, Ocasio-Cortez spoke of hope and moral duty. In the other, a bar chart showed a vertical spike in parole admissions that felt impossible to ignore. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that the battlefield had shifted. She was no longer fighting poetry with poetry. She was being forced to defend a moral crusade against a landslide of spreadsheets. In a dim hallway behind the community center's stage, she pulled her chief of staff aside. Her expression was one of intense reflection rather than the usual fury. "He's running circles around them with data," her aide whispered, gesturing to a tablet showing Miller's latest interview topping 8 million views. Ocasio-Cortez didn't look away from the screen. She understood that while statistics don't tell the story of a mother fleeing violence, they do tell a story of systemic scale that voters were beginning to fear. "Then we stop fighting over numbers," she replied, her voice low but resolute. "We talk about people, but if he wants to speak in data, I will have to learn that language too." The shift in public sentiment was immediate and measurable. On social media, the fact check became a weapon used against her idealism. Users posted screenshots of her quotes about America being a moral problem next to the DHS figures, suggesting that her passion was a reactionary dodge to hard data. Even journalists who had previously praised her conviction began to admit that the optics now heavily favored Miller. The narrative of "the room goes silent" began to take on a new meaning. It wasn't just a room in Congress anymore. It was the silent realization of an entire electorate watching a fundamental shift in their country's border policy, revealed through official documentation. Miller saw this as the moment the narrative cracked. In his office, he adjusted his cufflinks with a slow, deliberate motion, preparing for the final move. He wasn't interested in a victory lap. He wanted an encounter that would expose what he believed was the fundamental hollow at the center of the administration's policy. He agreed to a proposal that had been floating in the media for days: a one-on-one, face-to-face debate in a neutral studio. No entrenchment, no cheering crowds, and no House floor rules to hide behind. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also saw the necessity of this duel. She knew that another floor speech or another Instagram Live would look like deflection. To reclaim the humanity of the debate, she had to walk directly into the territory of the strategist. She accepted the invitation with one condition: that the conversation remain focused on the fundamental question of what America owes to its people versus its promise. As both leaders prepared to leave their offices for the neutral studio, the air across Washington felt heavy with the weight of the coming confrontation. This was no longer just a political disagreement. It was a collision of two different philosophies of truth. One believed that the law is a cold instrument of sovereignty that must be protected at all costs. The other believed that the law is a living vessel for justice that must adapt to human suffering. The stage was set for a masterclass in political theater, where the only thing louder than their words would be the moments of silence in between. Miller walked toward his waiting car, a stack of folders under his arm, his mind already 3 steps ahead. He knew that the 1.8 million figure was just the beginning. The real conflict lay in the long-term impact on the labor market and social services topics he was eager to press. Ocasio-Cortez took a final look at the Bronx streets she represented, exhaling slowly as she centered herself for the fight of her political life. She knew the numbers were a challenge, but she believed the faces behind those numbers held a truth that no spreadsheet could capture. Both knew that by the time the studio lights dimmed that evening, the country would have a much clearer picture of who was winning the battle for the real America. The prose of the law and the poetry of the heart were finally moving toward a face-to-face duel that would leave only one side standing stronger. If you want to see how this turned out, make sure to hit that like button and stay tuned for the final showdown. The debate over humanitarian parole is more than just a legal dispute. It's a window into how the U.S. government handles its borders. Between 2021 and 2024, the parole process was utilized for nearly 1.88 million individuals, including specific programs for nationalities like Ukrainians, Venezuelans, and Haitians. This represents a massive increase from the roughly 600,000 processed in the decade prior. When you see these numbers, it's easier to understand why the room went silent. If you're looking for practical steps to navigate these complex topics, start by looking at primary data. You don't have to take anyone's word for it. Now is the time to check official reports yourself. Go to the DHS website, search for the latest Enforcement Task Force numbers, and compare them to previous years. This is how you build a fact-based perspective without the filter of political spin. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe executive power should be used this broadly, or should Congress have the final say? Let's get a real conversation started. Don't wait, engage now, and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that define our world. The studio lights are blinding, casting sharp shadows across a set designed for civil discourse, but now serving as an arena for an ideological duel. Stephen Miller and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sit barely 3 feet apart, the physical proximity amplifying the psychological distance between their two versions of America. The air conditioning hums with a low, mechanical drone, a sound that feels increasingly loud as the moderator steps back. This isn't just an interview, it is the moment the national narrative hits a breaking point. Miller leans forward, his expression unreadable, and his voice devoid of the usual political theater. He asks a single, devastatingly simple question that cuts through the layers of rhetoric. What do you say to the American citizens whose wages are undercut by illegal labor, whose schools are overcrowded, and whose hospitals are at a breaking point while you talk of compassion? The camera holds on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's face, catching the exact second the practiced cadence of her defense falters. This is the moment the narrative cracked. She starts to speak, her lips part, but no sound comes out. For 20 seconds, the room goes silent. It is a masterclass in the power of a void. In political media, silence is usually edited out, but here, it is the revelation. Without the protective shield of jargon or historical metaphors, the unscripted truth of the conflict is laid bare. Miller doesn't smirk or interrupt to score a cheap point. He simply waits, his eyes locked on hers, forcing the weight of the question to settle. The tension is electric, a literal duel of law without humanity versus humanity without law. When Ocasio-Cortez finally answers, the fire of her House floor speech has been replaced by a tone that is cautious and measured. She speaks of the complexity of the American economy and the dual responsibility of a nation to its people and its promise. But the earlier paralysis has already left its mark. The cornered moment becomes a cultural echo. After the cameras stop rolling and the blinding lights dim, the two depart through different doors without a word of reconciliation. Later that evening, the relevance of that silence becomes clear, as clips of the 20-second pause go viral globally, stripped of commentary. Inside her car, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sits in the dim light of the street lamps, scrolling through the reactions on her phone. She pulls up a message thread with her chief of staff and begins to type. "He was right to ask," the text reads. "The data won the emotion tonight. I need to have a better answer for the promise of America." Meanwhile, Miller reflects privately on what he calls the honesty in silence, recognizing that the absence of words revealed more than any spreadsheet ever could. The duel concludes, not with a victory lap, but with a lingering question. Who does American compassion truly belong to? To understand the broader context of this confrontation, one must look at the underlying economic data often cited in these debates. Studies on the fiscal impact of immigration show a complex picture. While some analyses suggest high-skilled immigration boosts overall GDP, other reports, focusing on low-skilled labor markets, indicate a potential downward pressure on wages for native-born workers without a high school diploma. For instance, research by groups like the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS, suggests that a 10% increase in the supply of low-skilled labor can lead to a 3% to 4% reduction in the wages of competing native workers in specific sectors like construction or hospitality. In 2024, data indicated that there were approximately 30 million foreign-born workers in the U.S. labor force, representing nearly 19% of the total. Within certain low-skilled occupations, that percentage rises significantly, fueling the concerns Miller voiced. Furthermore, the strain on public infrastructure is quantifiable. In major metropolitan areas receiving high volumes of parolees, school districts have reported thousands of new enrollments midterm. In Chicago, officials estimated that providing for over 35,000 new arrivals cost the city over $300 million in a single fiscal year. In New York City alone, the fiscal cost of providing shelter and services to asylum seekers was projected to reach $12 billion over 3 years. These are the prose elements, the hard numbers that eventually force the poetry of the debate into that singular, silent moment of reflection. If you found this analysis of the power of silence in politics insightful, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We are committed to bringing you the unscripted truth behind the headlines. What do you think? Can a nation truly care for both its citizens and its global promise simultaneously, or is one always sacrificed for the other? This is a question you can't afford to ignore. For a practical perspective, try looking at the budgetary reports of your local municipality. Search for migrant services supplemental funding to see the direct fiscal impact in your own backyard. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue deep diving into the stories that define our era. Click the bell icon so you never miss a breakdown of the debates that move the needle of history. The conversation is just beginning. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you in the next deep dive. Don't wait, the narrative is shifting as we speak. The news cycle eventually moved on to newer controversies, but the viral clips of the silence between Stephen Miller and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez became a permanent fixture of the American political archive. In the immediate aftermath, the shift in political relevance was measurable and profound. Miller's approval ratings experienced a significant spike among conservative demographics, particularly those who prioritized national sovereignty and legal precision. Simultaneously, Ocasio-Cortez saw an unexpected rise in engagement from independents and moderate voters. Many cited a newfound respect for her willingness to reflect and admit the gravity of a difficult question, rather than resorting to a scripted talking point. The story, however, lived on far beyond the digital metrics. Across the American landscape in cafes in the Bronx and offices in D.C., the conversation shifted from superficial identity politics back to fundamental questions of sovereignty and ethics. The narrative had cracked, revealing a deeper national divide that could not be solved by slogans alone. The duel demonstrated that while facts don't care about feelings is an effective political weapon for winning data-driven arguments, it is ultimately feelings that define the nation and its moral direction. This tension remains the defining characteristic of the modern immigration debate. In the final assessment, Miller managed to win the argument on primary data, yet Ocasio-Cortez maintained the claim on humanity. Both leaders are now operating in a political world where the public's appetite for unscripted truth has grown. The final scene of this chapter shows both figures back at their desks, reviewing new reports and drafting future statements. They are preparing for the next round because, in the battle for America's soul, there is no final victory. The unresolved nature of the immigration crisis continues to be a structural challenge for the United States, leaving the electorate to grapple with a haunting philosophical question: who does America's compassion belong to? Does it belong to its people, or does it belong to its promise? The broadcast never answered it. It didn't have to. The silence did. From a prospective outlook, the immigration landscape remains in flux. Government records show that the foreign-born population in the United States reached a record 51.6 million in early 2024, an increase of 5.1 million since early 2021. This group includes nearly 14 million Mexican immigrants, 3 million Indian immigrants, and 2 million Filipino immigrants, among others. Getty Images. As long as these structural shifts continue, the clash between the prose of the law and the poetry of ideals will persist. For those looking to understand the future of American policy, the lesson is clear. Watch the moments, not just the messages. When the noise of Washington fades, the silence reveals exactly where the country is headed next. Make sure to like this analysis if it helped you see the bigger picture, and subscribe to stay updated on the data that truly matters. Stay informed, look at the primary data for yourself, and remember that in a democracy, the ultimate answer belongs to you. Join the conversation in the comments below. Who do you think won the heart of America? Don't wait. Your voice is the next part of the story.